Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian. I'm a PhD at the University of Florida, Department of Anthropology. This was meant to be a joint presentation, but my master's advisor wasn't able to make it, so I will do all of it myself, which actually works better. Um, so thank you for being here. The title is a little provocative, and that's on purpose. A quest for a science of culture, I think, is an important thing to point out because I don't really have answers so much as I have provocations, and I want to put those to the room and hear what people have to say. But before we start off, next, yay. So this is my current research. I'm looking at food perceptions in the Solomon Islands, and I have a representation for where that is. Actually, maybe let's do that. So, so here are the Solomon Islands. It's an archipelago of about 928 islands in the Western Pacific, in the Pacific. It's about 3 hours from Brisbane. It's been populated for 40,000 years by a Melanesian group of people, and it's a very fascinating country. Oh, that's not the pointer. The point is not pointing. I work around here, the kind of New Georgia region, in an area called the Roviana Lagoon, which is fascinating in and of itself. But I'm looking at food perceptions there because there's been a lot of ecological change and there's been a lot of economic change with integration into the global market, for example. Um, and the reason I'm interested in food is because food is a great entry into broader socio-ecological and economic questions. And among the many things that I want to do is I want to use ethnosemantics, or I am using ethnosemantics, um, to study how language reflects and shapes cultural values and beliefs among Western Solomon Islanders in the Roviana Lagoon. And in order to achieve that, I'm using Helmslev's commutation test, which I've been working with Ludmilla, among other people, to kind of refine for my purposes. And next, my research topic is a little challenging within anthropology because it touches a little bit on the material in the sense of political economy, domestic economy, systems ecology, that sort of thing, although not directly. But it also touches at the mental, the sort of the cognitive schemata or models or understandings that people use to engage with their physical environment. And this is a sort of long-standing tiff within anthropology between what's called, you could say, mentalist versus materialists, idealists versus materialists again, the cognitive types versus the ecological types. And it's a serious conversation because it has downstream effects with even the way we define culture. And the question becomes, can there be a science of anthropology that integrates both perspectives? Because it's my view that ecological material conditions are real and true and they have a causal effect. But mental schemata and people's understandings of themselves and the world around them also have a causal effect. And so you can't have one without the other. Therefore, these two things have to be brought together. And so this is an epistemological question about how we create knowledge and how is that knowledge valid and how do we share that knowledge? There are broader ethical questions. And that forces us to interrogate our base assumptions about whether we can even formalize something like a science when you're studying people, because anthropology's object of study is a subject. I, as an external observer who goes into a community, am studying participating with, co-creating knowledge with internal observers. And so there are these observer dynamics which maybe escape formalization. And so that's a serious epistemological question. So I'm here to rehabilitate Marvin Harris's image a little bit, which is a controversial task in anthropology because he formalized a method called cultural materialism in the 70s, 1978. Initially, he was at Columbia University, and then he was at my university, the University of Florida. And cultural materialism has many issues, but I think that people often critique Harris without having read him for sure and understood parts of his formal method. And so that's what I want to go with, talk about today. So my case inspired by Harris is that ethnography and ethnology are both predicated on the description of behavioral and mental events. And so behavioral events are, broadly speaking, the things that the external observer can see and describe with interpretation, but it'd be something like she collects water from the river. There is an interpretation that goes on there, sure, but it's something a little more concrete, and it's not really concerned with the subjective mental states yet. That's where mental events come in, and those get at the subjective sort of beliefs held by the people you're working with, and even yourself if you want to do something a little more reflexive. Um, and so you could say that behavioral events are directly observable, and you could say mental events are obscured by their subjective nature. Of course, these are totalizing statements. There's always nuance in the interplay, but it serves our purposes. And so, if you're trying to actually understand how to formalize this from the perspective of an internal observer and external observer, um, you need to use imics and itics, which were terms coined by the American linguist and anthropologist Kenneth Pike. And if you can see, they are the suffixes of phonemic and phonetic. And so an emic strategy would be one that looks at the internal logic, and an etic one would be an external description of the behavior that's being observed. And I think that, well, I don't think it's Kenneth derived emics and etics directly from Caesura's work. It's signified. And so you put it into a little epistemological matrix. This is straight from Marvin Harris's book. And you get behavioral emics, behavioral etics, mental emics, mental etics. And this works as a framework for you to categorize your descriptions once you've written them down. So let's start with behavioral ethics because I think it's the simplest. He places food on a small household altar. Uh, I should say this, the frame here is about food because I'm working with food, so I thought it would be a nice example. A behavioral emic account would be he offers food so that his ancestors will not go hungry in the spirit world. A mental emic a description could be he prays to ancestors because they guide and protect him. Mental ethics would be he believes unforeseen forces influence daily life. But I think there's a problem with this matrix in that it lacks an ontology. And that's a serious problem as far as I'm concerned for anthropology because it's not grounded in anything. And because it's not grounded, I would argue, in anything, it's been subject to both extreme reductionist accounts, excuse me again, and extreme relativist accounts. Good example would be in behavioral ecology, optimal foraging theory. Why is it that people make the sort of foraging behaviors they do? Well, it's purely a cost-benefit analysis where people look at the expected caloric intake vis-a-vis the calories they will expand in order to procure a food item. And that's it. That's why people make the decisions they make. Simultaneously, you get the extreme constructivist view, which is popular in postmodern anthropology, which is, well, we cannot really know. There's no truth statement, there's no truth value, it's all subjective. And even on the further, more political end, it's all an imperial, colonial, Western project that's imposed on people without them accepting it. I don't buy either of those arguments. And sadly enough, this looks to me like it's a fundamental product of the bifacial sign, and especially the way it's played out in anthropology. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So I'm talking about it. And so I think that the ontology has to be explicit in order to help us make sense of an anthropology if we're trying to formalize it into a science or something resembling a science. Depends on your position. So I propose the addition of that third category, which would seem intuitive to many in this room, perhaps, but not everybody. And by doing this, you end up with a matrix that has what I call behavioral objects and mental objects. You could call them material objects or immaterial objects. The concept of love would be an immaterial object. Concept of a god, if you believe in one, would be an immaterial object. A shoe would be a material object. And so the examples I've got there are a household altar where the food offerings are made. For the behavioral object and for the mental object would be the belief that the ancestors consumed the essence of the food. You could also fine tune it a little bit. And this was a point made by Emanuela. She's not here. In her presentation, because she was trying to get at this multi-perspectival view with the lamps and the ball in the middle. And she was basically saying we need an ontic referent, and anthropology, not to say it doesn't have it, but there are certain areas where we haven't fully fleshed out our relationship with ontology. Um, so by integrating the object, I think this immediately puts us in the territory of a kind of realism from a philosophical perspective. I would argue against a, oh, there she is. Hi, Manuela. I just shouted you out. Um, uh, I would argue it shouldn't be a naive realism because I don't think that your perceptions are isomorphs. I don't think that we have access to reality in its purest form. I think that we are mediated by our evolutionary history, by our cultural upbringing, et cetera, and that colors the way we see the object. But there is an object. Um, and I think that researchers and participants, which is an interesting choice of words because I think researchers participate as well in the knowledge production process, but researchers and participants are both subjects whose mutual presence affects one another, and that needs to be taken into account. Like I said, I'm more of an indirect perceptual realist, which I think skirts the problems of reductionism, but also skirts the problems of an extreme subjectivism. And I think that allows us to make truth statements, and they can be an actual truth value, and we can interrogate things. And this revivifies ethnology, which would be or let's say, it revivifies ethnography, which is still around, the study of a cultural unit, but it also makes possible ethnology, which would be the comparative work between cultural units, which is a testy endeavor for numerous reasons these days. So the consequences, from my view, are, I think, pretty obvious, but perhaps not. Science and matter are co-constitutive. Neither, so this is purely from a human perspective. They're co-constitutive, neither purely cultural nor purely natural. They're in a dynamic interaction. And I think human meaning is not just cultural or symbolic in some abstract sense. Culture isn't an external symbol convention that we're just exposed to and we take in blindly. I think that it's entangled with material conditions that sustain and transform it. For example, how food taboos are simultaneously symbolic, signifying purity or identity, and materially grounded in the ecological availability, the history, the health, all these sorts of things. And I think that the idea that material conditions and science co-constitute each other means that the act of observing and meaning making is itself a material process. It's not only a material process, but it can be recognized as such. And I think scientific knowledge is not just a representation of objective reality, it's a co-construction between the material world and the symbolic frameworks we use to understand it. Doesn't mean that you can't make a truth claim. Doesn't mean we have to be careful about the truth claims we're making. And it also means that we have to be humble about the limits of the claims that we make. And so how does this work out practically for my work? I love network analysis. I adore network analysis. And I was heavily influenced by Robert Ulanowitz, Bob, out at the University of Florida, and he's kind of involved in biosemiotics. He published with Sven Jorgensen and Soren Norris Nielsen. Lovely guy. I haven't seen him in a while. I should call him. And he is very against the kind of Newtonian view, the mechanistic view of ecology. But he's also interested in how you have variables that interact within an ecological system. And he has a theory which he calls ascendancy that's predicated on average mutual information between variables. And I believe strongly that you could use that to better understand ethnosemantic networks. Now, the reason it's a network is because food meanings aren't linear. They're not syntactic. It's more paradigmatic paradigmatic information. It's context-based. And so it's better to preserve the web-like structure where you have your nodes or signs from a semiotic perspective, and you have your edges, your connections. Um, and these little values here are the average mutual information, which is it, how much knowledge do you get about one variable from the other? So within this context, this is hypothetical, it's not real research. I was looking at discipline, and the idea there would be, well, father and discipline, that's a normative relationship. And so it's a high core, 0.08, um, uh, what is it? Units of mutual information exchange. The closer you get to one, it's a complete isomorph. The further you get from one, there's less mutual information. And I think within this, everything I've been saying is encapsulated in a nice, physical, useful, applicable diagram that will help the people of the Solomon Islands and help myself and further Helmsleth's theory, which I'm very appreciative of. I wanted to transform the commutation test into something that wasn't just a heuristic, but that had some statistical power. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you. My email and my main references. I, you could probably. Well, I mean, to me, it sounds a lot like kind of the species question, like the speciation. It's like, when does the dog begin? Is there a point where you can put a line and say, well, this everything after this is a dog and everything before is not a dog? I think mental products have a similar, mental objects have a similar nature, but probably in a more contracted time span. A lot of the work I do is descriptive, and so my caveat is, it looks to me like these objects, in the way they understood, exist in this slice of time, and you could have longitudinal studies to see whether that's true or accurate, whether the node can still be found within the social network 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Um, but the question of impermanence, it depends on the object, it depends on the dynamics, and this is not metaphysical. Um, I'm not making any metaphysical claims about the existence of love as a Platonic form or anything like that. This is purely sort of sociocultural. Might exist as a Platonic form, and this is one expression of it, but that's the best I've got for you. Because I was applying for an NSF, National Science Foundation grant in ethnosemantics. That gets the bucks. Which one? On? Oh, the this one here. No, you can make this more dynamic. You do something like, Giulio Tononi's notion of the at every moment things are affecting each other, but differently, right? Yeah. So like a transient functional relationship as a mathematical way of showing how these nodes would move around in, say, we'll say everyday discourse versus religious ritual or something like that. The same nodes, right, could be captured more dynamically if you put a way of mapping them as in context. Okay. I'll look into that. I didn't know about. Uh, Thank you very much. Sure. I'm not sure. Well, so maybe I'm not understanding. So let me know if I veer off course. But a lot of these nodes would be imically derived. And so with the commutation test, what you do is you go in and you ask, it's kind of like you go in with a set of questions, but there's play in those questions in that, for example, within a Western setting, well, the red light means go. The red light means stop. If you apply that within our context, one of those statements would be salient with a particular meaning and another wouldn't be. Um, and so there is some pruning on the part of the research, and that you kind of make the qualitative decision of which of those responses are salient and which are not a little bit. But I think that the knowledge is fundamentally co-created because you're not assuming that there'll be certain nodes will have a particular valence. You just kind of work with what is, I don't want to say derived, but what emerges from the people you're working with. And so I think that kind of helps to taper some of those power dynamics where people kind of, they call it Jesus smuggling, where, you kind of, you smuggle your own assumptions into the question and then you claim that you found it. But I don't know if does that get it, at what you're asking? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. You start off with a free listing exercising and then pile sorts. So you say a particular domain, foods that derive from marine products. That's your kind of catch-all term. And people free list every item that comes to mind. And then you can have them pile sort the free listed items into, like foods we eat for ceremonial reasons, foods we eat every day, foods that were popular once but are not as popular. So it's it's emergent. Okay. Well, I think the advantage, firstly, is to recognize that there is such a thing as love, and that isn't culturally specific. Um, perhaps not. That would be an open question, but at least there's a common basis. The other advantage to my work is really pragmatic in the sense that it comes from the anthropological literature, where, anthropologists, we have a weird relationship with semiotics in that we all kind of like bow down and we kneel to the semiotic gods as we should, but we don't acknowledge its use and power to the extent that perhaps we once did. And so I think that this is a really good way of getting semiotic and biosemiotic ideas out to a more general popular audience. Um, and was there another bit to your thing, Alexi? I would say it's a pragmatic approach. Just so call it pragmatic semiotics. It's not as catchy, Alexi. It's not as catchy. That's true. And he was at University of Florida too in the end. Yeah, maybe you've convinced me. I think. Hello. Thank you. Please. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yep. You you caught me. You caught me. That's true. There I am in the broader scheme of things, I am making metaphysical claims, but I'm making, at least in this presentation, a methodological argument that's based in pragmatic semiotics, in the sense that any discipline is always engaging in philosophy. It's almost impossible not to, but I'm not confident or qualified enough. Maybe I don't have enough confidence in myself to extrapolate what I'm saying as a general sort of philosophy beyond anthropology and what I can do when I'm working in a particular environment. And so the reason I said that I wasn't making metaphysical claims was not to say that they aren't important and they don't impact the work, and that I'm not saying there's an object, which is a clear metaphysical claim, but I'm making a sort of pragmatic use value argument for for the sake of trying to formalize an approach to ethnography and ethnology. Then we can have the fight later on about, okay, well, how much of the object are you seeing? 10%, 5%? Is there an object? Do you, those sorts, but, well, is there an object? We have to kind of agree on that, I think. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I'm vaguely familiar with that work, and I was Jesus smuggling it into Harris because Harris doesn't have that sort of laid out. And so in a way, I was trying to kind of unite the kind of the ontological work that's going on kind of separately from the Harris tradition, and say, well, these two things don't have to be separate. They are commensurate. And I was trying to provide a framework showing how they are commensurate. So I acknowledge that. Sure. Thank you very much. That's me. Lovely. Thank you.